The winter skies over Europe in 1943 were a place no one wanted to be, not unless they had to. At 25,000 feet, the cold could freeze a man in minutes, and German fighters ruled the clouds like predators waiting for the kill. Yet into that sky flew a 22-year-old kid from New Jersey named Staff Sergeant Michael Romano, a B-17 tail gunner whose job was to protect his bomber from the enemy he couldn't even see coming. Tail gunners had the most terrifying seat in the flying fortress. Behind them, nothing. Below them, nothing. Just a thin shell of aluminum and plexiglass separating them from a 300-mile-per-hour death. And when the enemy attacked, the tail gunner became the first target. The Luftwaffe knew that knocking out the tail meant opening the B-17's defenses like a door. But Romano wasn't frightened. Or maybe he was. Everyone was. But he was wired differently. He wasn't just a gunner. He was a thinker, a tinkerer. Someone who believed every problem had a solution if you looked at it from the right angle. And he saw a big problem. Tail gun accuracy was abysmal. 8% of shots hit anything. 8%. That meant for every 100 bursts of fire, 90 plus disappeared into empty sky, while German fighters ripped formation after formation to pieces. Yet no one questioned it. The army said the system worked. The manuals said it worked. The officers said it worked. Romano knew better. Sitting in his cramped, freezing turret on mission after mission, he could feel the flaw, literally. The iron sight forced him to line up the tiny metal post with a tiny ring while his aircraft vibrated violently, while he wore bulky gloves, while German fighters screamed in from impossible angles. It wasn't just difficult, it was unworkable, and men were dying because of it. Romano started seeing the dogfights in patterns, the angles of attack, the timing of the runs, the blind spots. Every mission, every burst of fire, every missed opportunity burned into him. Why, he wondered, do fighter pilots get reflector sights? Bright, intuitive, fast. But we tail gunners are stuck with this antique piece of metal. One night, sitting in the dimly lit maintenance hangar, freezing tools on the bench in front of him, Romano made a decision that would change everything. If the army wouldn't fix the problem, he would. No approval, no authority, no permission, just raw ingenuity and the stubborn belief that lives could be saved if someone dared to try. And so began a secret project, quiet, illicit, and more dangerous than any of the missions he'd flown. Romano's plan sounded insane even to him. Build a reflector sight system for the B-17 tail gun, using junk. The Army had already dismissed the idea as mechanically impossible. Tail turrets vibrated too much, the angles were too irregular, and the gunner's head position was never fixed. A reflector sight was, according to the engineering officers, simply not viable. But that only made Romano want it more. His workshop was a corner of the maintenance hangar, a dim, oily place full of loose bolts, cracked plexiglass, broken mirrors, and aircraft parts that had long since given up the ghost. Perfect. He wasn't building something beautiful. He was building something that would save lives. He scavenged a mirror from a wrecked B-24. He found a lens assembly from a gun sight that had been damaged on landing. He used spent brass casings as mounts. Even his tools were borrowed or improvised. He sketched ideas on scraps of paper, erased them, redrew them, tore them up, started again. He thought about the fighter aces who hunted his bomber. They didn't line up iron posts. They used illuminated dots projected onto glass. Fast, fluid, instinctive. Romano wanted the same for the tail. Something he could snap his eyes to and instantly know where the bullets would land. Night after night, he worked in secret, wrapped in a heavy jacket, to fight the cold of the unheated hangar. Every time footsteps approached, he covered the parts with a canvas tarp. What he was doing was forbidden. Adjusting a weapon system without authorization could get him grounded, or worse. But he couldn't stop. Every mission replayed in his mind. He remembered the bomber that fell behind on the Bremen raid, flamed by a Focke-Wulf that came straight for the tail. He remembered the men who didn't come back. He remembered staring at his useless iron sight, feeling the fighter fill his view before diving away untouched. He refused to let that happen again. Bit by bit, the sight took shape. A reflector mirror angled forward, a small housing to shield it from glare, a mount that let him adjust the position with gloved hands. The design wasn't pretty. It was a Frankenstein mixture of parts never meant to work together. But when he slipped it into place during a late-night test fit inside the turret, something felt right. He powered a small bulb behind the lens. A faint red dot glowed. Romano leaned in, moved his head side to side, tracked imaginary fighters across the hangar ceiling. The dots stayed aligned. Fast, smooth, natural. It worked. In the cold turret, breath fogging in the air, staring at the sight no one believed could exist. After weeks of stolen hours and improvised engineering, he had built the impossible. But now came the real test, the battlefield. And that meant breaking the rules in the most dangerous way possible. Romano knew installing the sight for a live mission would be risky, career-ending risky. Weapon modifications required layers of inspection, approval forms, signatures from officers who didn't even know where the tail turret was on a diagram. If he asked permission, they'd say no. If he hit it, they'd never know, unless something went wrong. But something was already going wrong. Tail gunners were dying. Bombers were going down. And the Luftwaffe wasn't getting weaker. So before dawn on a frigid morning, while his crew prepared their B-17 for a deep strike into Germany, Romano quietly mounted the sight inside his turret. No one noticed. No one asked questions. Tail gunners were invisible until the shooting started. Once in the air, the familiar terror settled in. Frost crawled across the plexiglass. The engines thundered. The bomber formation stretched across the sky like a chain of vulnerable giants. Romano tested his new sight. Fast tracking, smooth motion, the glowing dot steady even in turbulence. Every second his confidence grew. Then the German fighters came. It started as shadows flickering in the distance, then black dots, then the rising scream of engines. Focke-Wulfs dove at the formation in coordinated teams, a deadly choreography perfected over years of combat. Romano braced himself, guns at the ready. But this time, something was different. He could see, not just in the visual sense, but in the tactical sense. His brain finally had a tool that matched the speed of the battle. The fighters weren't blurs anymore. They were targets on predictable paths. The glowing dot followed them easily. No more squinting. No more aligning two pieces of metal while the aircraft shook uncontrollably. When the first FW-190 flashed into range, Romano squeezed the triggers. His burst didn't vanish into empty sky. It connected. The fighter broke away trailing smoke. He didn't know if it crashed, but he knew he'd hit it. Adrenaline surged. Another fighter approached. Romano led it perfectly using the glowing dot. More hits. Another break-off. His voice cracked over the intercom. "Tail to pilot. Keep her steady. I'm getting good strikes." The rest of the crew was too busy to care. But Romano knew something extraordinary was happening. His accuracy had tripled, maybe more. The fighters stopped choosing his bomber as their primary target. They peeled toward easier prey. Romano's bomber made it home. Dozens didn't. But the ones that survived had one thing in common: a tail gunner who suddenly could shoot like a fighter ace. Back on the ground, he expected praise. Instead, he received orders. Word spread fast. The armorers were the first to notice the strange device inside the tail turret of Romano's bomber, wired together with scavenged parts. They reported it up the chain. Within hours, Romano was summoned to his commanding officer's office, a place no enlisted man wanted to be. The officer held the improvised sight in his hands like it was a bomb. "What is this?" he demanded. Romano explained nervously at first, then with passion. "The accuracy problem. The reflector system. The results." The officer's face hardened. "You do not modify army equipment without authorization. Ever. Do you understand?" Romano did, but he didn't accept it. "Sir, it worked," he insisted. "I hit more fighters on this mission than in the last 10 combined." The officer didn't care. Regulations came first. Creativity last. "You will remove this device immediately," the officer said. "And you will not attempt anything like this again." But something unexpected happened. Another officer overheard the conversation, an operations major who had access to gun camera footage. He stepped in, breaking the tension. "What tail position was firing in these frames?" he asked, holding a stack of photos. Romano raised his hand. The major looked at the photos again. German fighters breaking off under accurate fire. Bursts landing exactly where they should. "You did this?" he asked. "With that sight? With a homemade device?" Romano nodded. The major looked at the commanding officer. "Maybe we shouldn't dismiss this so quickly." A quiet argument followed. Regulations versus results. Order versus innovation. Lives versus paperwork. Romano watched the two officers debate the future of his invention. His forbidden, illegal, life-saving invention. Finally, the major made the call. "Leave the site in place," he ordered. "We're testing it on the next mission." Romano felt a wave of relief wash over him. But the commanding officer wasn't done. "If this fails," he warned coldly, "you will be personally responsible for the consequences." It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. Romano returned to his bomber with shaking hands. He wasn't afraid of combat. He was afraid of failure. He'd bet everything, his career, his reputation, maybe even his freedom, on a device built from junk. The next mission would make or break him. And the entire aircrew knew they were flying with something unapproved, untested by the Army, but undeniably promising. As the engines roared to life, Romano settled into his turret and placed his eye behind the glowing dot. One way or another, history was about to judge him. The next mission was deeper, more dangerous, and almost guaranteed to draw heavy Luftwaffe resistance. Romano felt every vibration, every shift of the bomber as they climbed through thick cloud layers. His hands rested on the grips of his twin .50 caliber Brownings. The glowing dot hovered on the glass, steady and sure. They crossed the coast. Then the flak began. Black explosions hammered the formation, shaking the flying fortress. Romano's turret bounced violently, but the sight stayed aligned, proof his homemade mounting system worked better than the Army engineers had predicted. Then came the fighters, dozens, swarming from above, below, and behind. Romano called out, "Bandits, 6 o'clock high, closing fast." The tail became the center of the storm. FW-190s and ME-109s dove at horrifying speed, cannons blazing. But this time, Romano wasn't reacting. He was anticipating. The reflector sight gave him something no tail gunner had before: time. A split-second edge in a world where survival depended on fractions of a second. His first burst hit a fighter square across the wing root. The FW-190 peeled away, trailing fuel. His second burst clipped another attacker, forcing it to break early. His third burst set a fighter on fire. The intercom exploded with voices. "Tail, keep it up. Good hits. They're avoiding us." For the first time, enemy fighters were actively steering away from Romano's bomber. They'd learned fast. Attacking through his field of fire now meant taking accurate, lethal fire. His crew felt the difference. They survived wave after wave of attacks with minimal damage. Other bombers weren't so lucky, but those flying near Romano lived longer, took fewer hits, lost fewer men. When they landed, mechanics counted strike marks on the turret, where bullets should have hit him. But they also counted the enemy aircraft confirmed, damaged, or destroyed. One of the highest tallies ever recorded by a single tail gunner in a single mission. Word spread beyond the squadron, then beyond the group, then beyond the wing. Crews began asking for the Romano sight. Armorers requested schematics. Pilots reported that tail attacks on Romano's bomber had decreased dramatically. The Army could no longer deny the results. They didn't care that it was illegal. They didn't care that it was built from scrap. They cared that it worked. Romano's invention didn't just improve accuracy, it tripled it. A tail gunner who once fought blind now fought with clarity. And that clarity saved bombers, saved crews, saved missions. Romano never asked for medals. He never sought recognition. But his improvised reflector sight system quietly influenced later designs and proved something the Army needed desperately to learn. Sometimes, the best innovations come from the men who fight, not the men who write the manuals. A 22-year-old tail gunner changed air combat with a mirror, a lens, and an idea everyone said was impossible. And thousands lived because he refused to accept no as the final answer.